And then we have generative AI. People expect it to answer everything. And it's not that intelligent. It is playing this giant game of Mad Libs, looking for common patterns. And sometimes it gets it right, and sometimes it says things that are phenomenally stupid or untrue. Defamation comes from that. It gives an illusion of being intelligent, but it can't fact check its own answers. It can't reason about its own answers. There's a new model that can do that a little bit, but not reliably. So I would say if intelligence is being able to adaptively solve novel problems in reliable ways, then it's not intelligent.
My name is Ken Broad, and I'm a longtime supporter of the Commonwealth Club with my wife, Jackie. We're supporting tonight's program in conjunction with my firm, Jackson Square Partners, and are delighted to welcome to the stage Gary Marcus and Rachel Myrow. Before we begin, just a few reminders. We do have C-SPAN actually recording tonight, so more than usual, please make sure your phones are turned off. If you have any questions for the speaker, they'll be coming around with little card that you can write down your question, and they'll be brought up here, and a number of those will be selected. For those online, please feel free. You can type in your question into the chat function. And for those of you here in person, thank you, first of all, for coming out on a really nice day. There will be free books available after the program for you to have signed by Gary. We also have a wine reception, so please, this is a hot topic, a lot of things to talk about, so we hope you'll stay and have a glass of wine and chat with other participants. The book is called Taming Silicon Valley. I just found out in the green room that he wrote it literally in 2 months, so probably a speed record for actual book completion. Gary is a leading voice in artificial intelligence. He's a cognitive scientist, well known for his research in human language development and cognitive neuroscience. As a successful entrepreneur, he was the founder of Robust AI and Geometric AI, which was acquired by Uber. Through significant work and research, Gary has anticipated many of the contemporary AI limitations. His fascinating new book, Taming Silicon Valley: How We Can Ensure That AI Works For Us, explains what is lacking, the greatest risks, and what a comprehensive AI policy should look like. Spoiler alert, there's going to be a lot of skepticism. Moderating tonight's program is Rachel Myrow. She's senior editor at KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk and a frequent moderator at the Commonwealth Club. Please join me in welcoming Gary Marcus and Rachel Myrow.
I thought I might start out, Gary, by reading a list here from page 70, the biggest immediate risks of generative AI. Let's just read it out. Disinformation, market manipulation, accidental misinformation, defamation, non-consensual deepfakes, accelerating crime, cybersecurity and bioweapons, bias and discrimination, privacy and data leaks, intellectual property taken without consent, over-reliance on unreliable systems, and last but not least, environmental costs. So, whew, any you missed? Because you did write this in 2 months, right?
I did actually write about I countenanced the possibility that I might have missed some. I think the one thing, it's already there, but that I really wish I had been able to add was a recent study in it's either Science or Nature showing covert racism. And what the authors showed is that if you speak in African-American English as opposed to standard English, you get a different answer from a chatbot. And that's actually covered in bias, I suppose, but it shows, even more vividly. And of course, like all of the things that I mentioned there were already on the table and have gotten worse. So, we are seeing misinformation in the course of our election and other elections around the world.
We were talking in the green room earlier that generative AI has been around for a few years now, but it's still like a game of Mad Libs, just filling in the blank. I'm wondering if...
Well, you had the great line that it was Mad Libs, but more expensive.
Yes, Mad Libs, but more expensive.
I wish I had written
Well, so explain for the audience here, who may not have had the chance to read the book. It's a rip-roaring read. You'll get through it pretty quickly. It's very, very... what's the word? Well written, but for like a general interest audience. Explain the problem with thinking that artificial intelligence is really artificial intelligence?
I mean, that's partly a definitional question. But I would say that the AI we have right now is not that smart. We have some narrow AI, like route finding, GPS, that actually works pretty well, is reliable, doesn't lead to any of the dozen risks that we just talked about, is perfectly fine. But nobody expects it to answer every single question. And then we have generative AI, and people expect it to answer everything. And it's not that intelligent. It is playing this giant game of Mad Libs, looking for common patterns. And sometimes it gets it right, and sometimes it says things that are phenomenally stupid or untrue. Defamation comes from that. It gives an illusion of being intelligent, but it can't fact check its own answers. It can't reason about its own answers. There's a new model that can do that a little bit, but not reliably. So I would say if intelligence is being able to adaptively solve novel problems in reliable ways, then it's not intelligent. If you want to say a chess computer is intelligent and have a definition that's like you can do one thing well, okay, then we have some of that. So it's partly definitional, but it's not trustworthy AI. It's certainly not AI we can trust.
Especially if you don't know what you're looking at when you're looking at an answer.
There's an old saying in the military, which is frequently wrong, never in doubt. And the thing about chatbots is they present themselves that way. And then if they get it wrong, they say, I'm so sorry. If you tell them they got it wrong when they got it right, then they'll say, I'm so sorry. Everything they say is authoritative. What I said on 60 Minutes actually was that it was authoritative. And it just all comes across as if it were true, but that doesn't make it true.
So among the apocalyptic developments that we've observed in the last few years, there's no more copyright law, or at least no more copyright law enforcement for the companies that develop large language models. Books full of stolen content on Amazon. I love these lines you wrote. Don't let them steal your content. Don't let them destroy the arts. The great data heist has to stop, and you need to get a cut. The first word in data should be consent. But Gary, other than those of us wealthy enough to hire our own lawyers, who among us can afford to fight?
Well, I mean, one of the things I suggest in the book is that we should actually all consider boycotting generative AI until the problems are solved. So going back to that list of 12, and as you can see, I've lost my voice, so I'm glad you read the list. If you go back to the list of 12, like these are consequences. They're negative externalities to society. You can think of like power plants that were belching chemicals into the water. Generative AI companies are belching negative consequences to society. They're ripping off artists. They're causing, huge environmental problems. It might cause much worse problems because the only solution they have to all of the poor reasoning and so forth is to make the models even bigger, maybe 1,000 times bigger, escalating the energy problems. The systems are racist, et cetera, et cetera. You can think like you might not want to have a cup of coffee that isn't fairly sourced, right? If the labor is exploited. Well, generative AI, every time you use it, it's exploiting artists. It's probably going to exploit you, whatever you do, because their end game is to take your job, whatever your job is, you as a journalist and what anybody out there might be doing. I have a whole stash of these, but thank you. So there's a lot of negative consequences to society. We could say, look, we all want to use AI, but not this AI. Make a better AI. Make one that we trust, that won't defame people, that won't rip off people's data. It's got to be possible in principle to learn most of what they do with better systems from data that are fairly sourced. It ought to be possible to make systems that aren't racist, that don't use so much energy. You use 20 watts, not gigawatts of power, right? So we could just demand better. We could say, we will boycott this stuff until they make it better. That's really why I wrote the book in the end, is to get the public to realize that the government's not going to take care of these problems. The companies aren't going to self-regulate and solve these problems. We have to get involved. We have to be loud. If we are, we could actually force the companies to do much, much better than they are.
Well, you've just hit my sweet spot. It's a full employment act for Rachel anyway, covering regulation or the lack thereof at the federal and the state level. Why don't we start with federal? Riddle me this. Senate hearing after congressional hearing after Senate hearing, some of which you've testified at, and very dramatic testimony at many of these hearings. And yet, new legislation seems to hit any desk of any president, Democrat or Republican.
That's right. I wrote the book in a rage in 2 months. And a lot of the rage really came from disillusionment, because I testified in the Senate in May of last year, 2023. And when I testified, all the senators in the room on both parties seemed to recognize how urgent it was. They all seemed to recognize how badly they had done with social media. They realized that Section 230 had caused great harm and so forth. And so I left the room thinking, wow, I've been part of this historic thing. They're going to go and actually do something here. You could argue about what that something should be, and a lot of the book is about that. But people in the room seemed very rational and well-motivated, and then nothing happened, right? There were a few people in the room that tried to write things, but Schumer put nothing forward, and so nothing got signed. The president didn't have any opportunity to sign anything. And I realized at some point that they were very unlikely to, and that's really why I wrote the book.
And it should be said that we're a long ways past that time when elderly lawmakers, and there still are many elderly lawmakers, don't have staffers, young staffers who understand what's going on.
There are lots of very bright staffers in town. I met tons of them after my testimony. I had a lot of closed door meetings, some with Congress people and Senator, House and Senate, some with their staffers. There are people that care, and there are people who don't. There's a mix, but the ultimate politics of it all leads to gridlock. There's a lot of money in the tech industry. There's a lot of lobbying. And so you can have, some keen staffers who read every new journal article or every new article on Archive and actually kind of know what's going on. But that still doesn't translate into Senator Schumer putting something forward that is actually voted on by the full Senate, that goes to the House, that gets the White House. Like, there's a long way from well-motivated staffers, and there are some, to actually getting anything passed. And I mean, that's another reason I wrote the book, is I think the public has to say, hey, this is not good enough. You can't sit on this. Look how badly you did on social media and how screwed we are right now.
I've spoken to a lot of state lawmakers here in San Francisco and in Sacramento who are very mindful of really two major failures at this point to step in and do something. Because in addition to social media, we also have what I like to call, and I wasn't the first one to coin it, right? The ad surveillance economy, these little cookies following everybody everywhere, trying to sell stuff to you and sell your information on to others to do with what they will. But let's just play devil's advocate for half a second. And let me ask you, what about the argument that, legislation, it's a sausage-making process, and it takes time. It takes a lot of deliberation and hand-holding and, back and forth between all kinds of interest groups before you finally land something. And generative AI is just moving too fast. This train is running at high speed, and, let's not have lawmakers or regulators get in the way of the goose that's laying all these golden eggs, especially for California and the Bay Area.
There's a lot to unpack there. One of the things to unpack there is that the Silicon Valley wants to persuade you that there's a golden egg, that there is a lot of money, but that doesn't actually bear scrutiny, at least so far. So about $100 billion, or let's say almost $100 billion has gone into generative AI. Cumulative profit has been $5 billion. So far, generative AI has been a huge money-losing proposition. And they've got everybody convinced that it's going to make a lot of money. But it's not clear how.
Well, some people are making a lot of money.
Well, the people that are making money are founders who sell their stock in secondary sales. Probably in this town, I don't have to explain what that is. There are venture capitalists who bet early. They make a lot of money. And then there are pension funds that may, who put their money in, who may actually lose a lot of money, right? Because in the long run, you can't really make money unless there are profits. So the early investors can, even if they're not. But people who get left holding the bag, not so much. So that's the first thing, is the premise that there's a lot of money is maybe not right. Sorry, remind me of the question, because I got sidetracked on the premise.
There are some people who say lawymakers and regulators like you to step aside. Right. Just let this thing happen.
Right. So I think there's a mistake in assuming or somehow some lobbyists in California, including companies like Andreessen Horowitz, have persuaded people that zero regulation is a rational way. That hasn't worked in any other industry. In fact, other industries benefit from regulation. There's a strong challenge in getting the right regulation. You don't want regulatory capture where the big companies write the rules, which is kind of the default. But think about, for example, airlines. Imagine commercial aviation if there were no regulation. It would be a complete disaster. Instead, it's incredibly safe because we have layered oversight. So we have multiple layers of regulation, and that allows the commercial aviation industry to be reliable enough that, I got on 5 planes as part of the book tour, and I felt like my life was probably not in danger doing that. What they want for AI is no regulation. We already have that list of dozen problems. There may be more. And that's just courting a backlash, right? At some point, something is going to go wrong, some massive cyber attack or something like that. And people who have fought regulation may actually find themselves in trouble. If Newsom doesn't sign this bill, 1047, and things go wrong, he will get blamed for it.
You brought up 1047, but
I know whereof I speak, literally.
Yes. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But I did want to say, but I seem to recall Sam Altman of OpenAI warning about the potential catastrophic impacts of generative AI, and
he did that at the Senate,
urging lawmakers. Yeah,
he did that at the Senate after I made him do it, which is an interesting little anecdote.
Tell us that story. Yeah.
So Senator Blumenthal, who convened the meeting, asked Sam, what's your most serious worry? Is it employment? And Sam proceeded to say, well, people have always lost their jobs. If they're new jobs, I'm not that worried about it. And he didn't answer the question of what your worst worry is. And I had been told in advance, like maybe once I could redirect. And I knew that was my moment because I wanted to have Sam on the record about these things. And so I said, Senator Blumenthal, Sam didn't actually answer the question. You should ask. And then Sam said, well, he was worried that AI could do serious harm to civilization. So that's a little anecdote there.
Well, brava, but this explains for me, I was under the misimpression that Altman was trying to talk up the magical powers of generative AI by scaring us first.
There is some of that. I think that when Altman talks about the worries, the sort of potentially serious harms, he's actually coming from multiple places at once. So one is he is trying to hype up how powerful this stuff is. And he's always trying to do that. He had an essay today where he's like, for sure, we have solved AI. Don't you worry about all the problems that we haven't solved. We will solve them. And that's just an empty promise. I mean, you think about it from a scientific perspective, and over again, we keep having the same problems, like hallucinations have been, I predicted those in 2001. They've continued for 23 years. We don't actually have a solution. So he likes to just wave them away and say, we're going to magic this out. So some of it's hype. And some of it is, he was born on the same day as Oppenheimer. He knows that. He's consciously aware of it. And he doesn't want to, be that guy who unleashed this on civilization. And he wants to say, well, I warned you, and cover his bases. So there's a mix of the kind of commercial operator, which looms strong, and some genuine concern. And in some cases, those align well enough that he tells a good story.
So Sam Altman isn't the only one to express concern about the potential catastrophic effects of these large language models. But
I don't know if, well, let's just unpack that little phrase, actually.
Yeah.
Which is, there are certainly catastrophic risks for AI, of some kind of future AI. I think the risks of today's current generative AI, which is just one way of doing AI, are probably not like the doomsday stuff that people think about. Like, this AI is not going to take over the world, but there are actually catastrophic risks. So, for example, there was a bill last year. Well, let's just pause for a second. So these things often make stupid mistakes. You just cannot count on them. So there was a bill last year saying you can't use AI, presumably generative AI, because it's what's popular, to make decisions about nuclear weapons without a human in the loop. The most rational bill I've ever seen in Congress. It failed, died, didn't get through. So it is legal to use generative AI, which is fairly stupid, to make nuclear weapons decisions. Maybe somebody will do that. That could lead to catastrophe, no doubt. So people often kind of conflate intelligence with danger. they're like, well, the more intelligent AI gets, the more dangerous it will be. But there's really like at least two variables, actually many. One is raw intelligence, and the other is empowerment. Like, what do you let the system do? If you let it act on nuclear weapons and it's stupid, that's a problem. If you have a naive, self-interested president who's not that intelligent with control of nuclear weapons, that's dangerous. So catastrophe could come from current systems, even if they're not smart enough to be like the Terminator and take over the world and all that stuff.
At the very least, it might help to turbocharge situations where people who are not that bright or have malevolent
That's right.
intent are taught how to make, terrible suffering for lots of people in lots of ways.
I'm not glad that that's happening, but I'm so glad that you used the word malevolent, because I think that's really cuts to the heart of it. Right now, the fear is not runaway AI that has its own intention or whatever. It's malevolent bad actors misusing AI for misinformation to manipulate the market. If they manipulate the market, that could lead to accidental war and things like that. So the worry right now is mostly malevolent actors.
So back to Sacramento and a bill you mentioned, 1047, Senate Bill 1047 by State Senator Scott Wiener of San Francisco. We're still waiting to find out if Governor Gavin Newsom is going to sign it. He has till the end of this month. And
clocks are ticking. Everybody's expecting that to go to the last minute, all the way down to
absolutely. And I can understand why Newsom would want to wait till the very last minute.
It's no win for him. Whatever happens, he's going to be.
He's going to be blamed. So it's so interesting. I mean, you have all of these generative AI professionals saying we want to protect against potential catastrophic outcomes. We have all these, red tag teams that are working hard to make sure that doesn't happen or try to make sure that doesn't happen, but don't actually put that in the law. Don't enshrine that in the law. Don't make us liable with a law. What's your read of that?
Of course, the generative AI companies don't want to have any liability. Of course, they're going to say, we're going to flee the state. We're going to stop innovating. It's garbage. One of the reasons you should sign the law is actually to smoke them out and to show that the generative AI companies are not going anywhere. They're going to keep innovating. There's some paperwork things that they have to do. If they really screw up, there's some liability or at least a route to it, but it's not going to stop anybody.
What do you make of some of the smaller, more specific AI laws that Gavin Newsom has already signed?
I haven't followed all of them. I believe there was a deepfake one that was signed in the last week. It sounds good, but I don't know all the details.
Just another thought that I have about 1047. So I think of it these days as kind of like a cobra with one fang. It was originally written to have what was called a frontier models division. And the idea was that you would have people who specialize in the technology crafting regulations. But that got written out during the sausage making process in Sacramento.
Yes, I like defanged. I mean, it really did.
But there's still one more fang. It's just that it's the state attorney general's office, which is, can be a tough customer when, whoever is in that position decides to go after a company of one sort or another. But it is just now one fang instead of two. And yet the industry keeps describing this bill as potentially catastrophic, existential for them.
But it's not. I mean, it would be like the cigarette company saying, if we have a 5-cent tax, we're going to go out of business, and North Carolina is not going to make any money more. It's just not true.
So back to devil's advocate questions. Silicon Valley has overpromised before and upended the job markets, and somehow we've all survived. Silicon Valley has privatized the profits and socialized the losses for decades, and somehow we've all survived. Why not let this party continue?
Quality of life has I think, declined. So I think For example, the polarization of American society from social media is a huge negative consequence. Like I cry every time I look at Twitter now. I mean, the level of hostility and mistrust and misinformation is just horrible. It's much worse than it was before. Or look at the data on teenage girls and depression. It's gone up so much in the last decade. So we're all still here, but I think there are ways in which quality of life has gone way down. Another scary thing, actually, going back to your very first question, that I might have wanted to add, although I hint at it at the book, is that large language models can manipulate people. And there was just a study showing that they can actually teach people false beliefs, implant false memories is the technical way to say it. There's a recent study with Elizabeth Loftus showing large language models implanting false memories. We could easily wind up in a world very soon where we're basically controlled by 3 or 4 large language companies. So yes, we still live, but we become part of a kind of Orwellian system. Like that would be a huge loss. You could say, in 1984, everybody was still alive, right? But you don't want to live in 1984.
Well, but I get back to the thought that perhaps overpromising has happened, and that as it becomes manifestly obvious that, things will change. And maybe it's industry specific. Maybe, first we change our attitudes about not so driverless cars. Maybe we change our attitude about pharmaceutical medicine discovery. Could an argument be made that, these guys will trip on their own coattails?
Well, I mean, they're going to lose a lot of money, I think. And, in that sense, life goes on. Some investors will lose money. I think I do worry about the pension funds that are going to lose money more than the individual investors, so be it. But so there will be that kind of financial side. But I'm only moderately worried about that. Like, okay, some people are going to lose money, such as life. I'm really worried about the kind of extension of the surveillance economy. I'm worried about what happens to democracy. There could be a one-way ticket in which we lose democracy in the United States or in some other countries. Those kinds of things might be irrevocable, might have very serious consequences. So the cost of the hype, the direct cost of the hype is simply that companies will lose a lot of money. The indirect consequences, we're giving so much power to a bunch of companies that are basically working on promise that can have a very negative influence on society. We're helping them to distribute these unpleasant products that are problematic. I don't know that they're going to make any money. I mean, if Meta is giving away this stuff for free, I don't see the business case. But now that it's out there, for example, terrorist countries can easily use the stuff to generate propaganda. So that's there, independent of the economics now. So I'm more worried about what the tools, which are blind to truth, are doing than I'm worried about the economics. I mean, let the economic chips fall where they may. But I want to know what kind of society we're going to live in if we give so much power to companies that can manipulate essentially anything that we think with these tools, can do surveillance at a scale way beyond what Facebook has historically done. Not everybody will know, but I'll sort of put it together. OpenAI is losing money, right? It lost $5 billion. They're under a lot of commercial pressure. The initial anticipation was that a lot of people would use the stuff in business, but it's not that reliable. So what I see signs of them doing is becoming a surveillance company. They want to collect essentially all of your data. They were working with Microsoft on this product, or I assume they were working with Microsoft on this product that was going to take screenshots every 5 seconds that got shot down by public disapproval. But they were interested in that. They're interested in getting your email and your calendars and stuff. And then they just made a big investment in a webcam company. Like, I put all that together, looks to me like OpenAI is the most Orwellian company in history, right? What they're really going to do is to become a surveillance company because there's no other way to justify the economics. Oh, and by the way, they put Paul Nakasone from the NSA, formerly of the NSA, on their board. So like, I see it all going in that direction.
Oh boy. Yeah, I imagine some of you are not going to be able to sleep tonight. And at the very least, you're...
But if for one night you can't sleep and then you go out and you tell your friends about this and we start a social movement, we might fight all of this. And the whole point of the book is that we're poised between utopia and dystopia. And the only way we're going to get out of this dystopia is if we stand up and fight.
So, well, let me challenge you on that. Like we've already talked about absolute gridlock in Washington, D.C. We've talked about perhaps salutary but limited efforts because it's just one state in Sacramento. Perhaps salutary but limited efforts in the European Union, which, is ahead of our country and many others in coming up with the AI Act. So that is a gigantic economic bloc of nearly 30 countries. But again, it's limited impact. What is your average citizen supposed to do?
One is I think we should think about boycotts. Two is I think people should be talking to their congresspeople. Three is they should be saying, hey, we have a federal election. We actually have many federal elections. We have we have Senate elections. We have the national election. Where do these people stand? Let's make them make commitments now before we vote them. Like make this part of the election. At the last debate, Kamala Harris mentioned AI once. Trump didn't mention it at all. We should say, hey, the decisions we make right now about AI are going to last like for decades, the way that early decisions about social media did. And if we just stand by, then, there's an old saying, people who don't vote deserve what they're getting. If we don't stand up, then the default is going to be essentially no regulation in the US. That's going to be culturally enshrined as it happened with social media, and we're going to be in trouble.
I've often felt, though, that if you want to know who's really in power in Washington, D.C., you watch what doesn't change between administrations. And here on at least the presidential end of the ticket in November, what is not on the menu? A serious commitment to tackle climate change, yeah. Right? A serious commitment to regulate generative AI. Yeah. I mean, both Trump and Harris appear to be falling over themselves in an effort both to curry favor with and garner money from Silicon Valley's elite.
And that is the default. Again, if we don't speak up, that's what happens over and over. And parallel to climate change is important, right? Almost nothing happened until people got really angry and really loud. Now, not enough is happening, but something is happening. We need to get angry and loud.
So for the benefit of people who have yet to read your book, give us the upshot on generative AI's impacts on climate change.
I mean, I soft sold that in a way because it's not entirely clear. I would say we know that it's already bad. There are a lot of questions about what you should measure and so forth. I will be vague. I don't know if you remember the old film Ghostbusters, and they use the phrase bad. What would that mean? And sort of use it to be catastrophic. So it's already bad. But the big worry I have is, so there's some competing variables. It could get better because we could figure out a more efficient way to build AI. Right now, everybody's using the same thing, which is intellectually sterile, like to have an intellectual monoculture. But in principle, we could do better. On the other hand, it's like the only idea in Silicon Valley right now to make things better, because they all know the systems don't really work. Sam Altman said GPT-4 sucks. That's a quote from him. So the only idea that they have is to make the models bigger, maybe 100 times bigger, 1,000 times bigger, 10,000 times bigger. That's why he wanted $7 trillion. It's because he thinks the only way to do it is to use massively more energy, massively bigger models. That would be really bad for the climate if we have to go in that direction.
Ooh, well, let's talk about something.
Sorry, let me just insert.
Yeah.
Microsoft, I guess, just made a deal or talked about a deal where they're turning 3 Mile Island back on and taking 100% of the power. That gives you some, small sense of the scope.
So let's talk next about model collapse. I hope this isn't horrifying you, but maybe it should horrify you. So define it for people.
Model collapse is the idea that we're training these models on their own outputs, and the quality reduces as we do that. You can think of snake eating its own tail. And partly reduces because they do hallucinate, they do make stuff up. And so they kind of drift away from reality. So that's what model collapse is. And it's not good. Nobody has good enough quantitative data to say how serious that problem is, but it's clearly already a problem.
And of course, there doesn't seem to be anything like a general solution to the problem of bias.
No, there isn't one. I actually got annoyed when everybody yelled at Google because they made pictures of American founding fathers who were Black and things like that. It was like, that is awful and historically wrong, but there's been so much bias in the other direction. Why was nobody upset about that? It's a huge problem. Nobody has a solution.
So I thought I might ask a selfish question next. The New York Times and the Associated Press are two really big media examples taking very different approaches to potentially existential threats from generative AI. One, the New York Times is suing. The other, AP cut a deal figuring, well, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yep.
What would you tell other newsrooms, say like KQED, about meeting what appears to be this game changer?
Wait and see what happens with the Times lawsuit. I think the Times will win, and that will give you a strong precedent. But yes, definitely people are playing that in both directions. I think ultimately it's completely unethical to use the copyrighted materials or without some kind of licensing, and we will move towards a licensing model. But whether we get there through lawsuits or deals is kind of open.
I was going to have you read something, but I think I'll give your voice a break and I'll read it instead. Let's see here. The best way to reflect on OpenAI and how far it has fallen from its original nonprofit mission is to look at their own mission statement. Here is a tweet from OpenAI introducing OpenAI. OpenAI is a nonprofit artificial intelligence research company. Our goal is to advance digital intelligence in the way that is most likely to benefit humanity as a whole, unconstrained by a need to generate financial return. Since our research is free from financial obligations, we can better focus on a positive human impact.
Who wouldn't want to work for a company with that masthead?
Oh my goodness, yes. You write, when I posted it on Twitter in March of 2023 with the simple caption, and I'm mindful that we need to be family friendly here, insert, quote, speaking of beep, anyone remember this? Investor and researcher Mona Hamdi replied by striking out every word that was no longer true. So the tweet looks like something.
Can you just hold up the picture for 1 second and then read it? Hers is on the right. You can see all the crossouts.
Yeah, so it's mostly blacked out. It looks like one of those, intelligence documents you sometimes get with a FOIA request. Instead of OpenAI, it just reads AI, and then introducing AI. AI is a profit artificial intelligence research company. Our goal is digital intelligence in most likely to generate financial return. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that.
I'll just add one thing, which is not everybody knows they are still legally a nonprofit, right? They still get some, tax protection and so forth. They have been requested to ask the California Attorney General has received a letter from a group called Public Citizen asking to investigate why do they still have nonprofit status, and if they shouldn't, then what should be the consequences, which might include forcing them to dissolve and give some portion of what they do to an actual charity. So that's still pending and I think important.
So there's a story I published recently headlined "How AI Could Ruin Documentary Film by Polluting the Truth." And I wanted to get your reaction to this quote from it. The two things we always struggle with, we being documentary filmmakers, are not enough money and not enough time, and especially not enough money. AI comes in and seemingly offers solutions to both those existential issues, but really it doesn't. I think the question that we always need to be asking is, at what cost? And, she's speaking in terms of looking at documentary film as our collective history. So if suddenly we don't know what percentage of any given documentary film is accurate, is true, is an accurate representation of history, it really muddies things.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that documentary film is not GPT's sport. GPT does not know how to tell truth. It knows how to make stuff up that sounds plausible. I gave a whole bunch of examples in the book, like saying that I have a pet chicken named Henrietta when I don't. Applying it to documentary film seems like a terrible idea, in part because the things that it makes up sound plausible and fact checkers miss them and so forth. And of course, people are going to start using deep fakes to like reconstruct things in documentary films. And I think the audiences are going to stop trusting documentary films, and that's going to undermine the entire effort.
Now, this particular organization that is addressing the issue has issued guidelines, and they're saying, look, if you're going to use it, fine. We've already seen, applications where it might make sense. But the key is to watermark everything, to within an inch of its life, just so that everybody knows exactly what they're looking at.
I do think one of the things we need to do is to watermark anything that's created by generative AI. Of course, we have lots of old footage which is not watermarked. So one of the problems with watermarking is you can introduce that now, but what do you do with all the stuff that existed before? And then you have problems like we don't really know how to watermark text. We can do it in videos because you have all these pixels you can hide things in. We don't know how to do it with text. So watermarking is technology we should use, but not put full faith in. It's part of a solution.
So I've played around with ChatGPT. I'll admit that here and now among a friendly audience. And I've noticed that it does seem to be getting better at telling me where information came from.
There are some kind of band-aids you can put on the systems to do that. But inherently, the way they work is they explode all the information that they learn, that they're trained on, into lots of little bits. And then they statistically reconstruct those bits, and they don't really know where those bits come from. So you have to put external tools to try to make best guesses. We call that the attribution problem. Nobody really has a solution. So for example, in some work I did earlier this year with the artist Reed Southan, we showed with the visual image systems, you could do things like say, show me a picture of Italian plumber, and out would come Mario from Nintendo. The system can't tell you that that's how it got it. It's just not built to be able to do that.
I did want to close with something you had written. I think this was an excerpt from the book that was published not too long ago about lies, half-truths, and omissions. Perhaps Adrienne LaFrance said it best, you wrote in an article in The Atlantic titled "The Rise of Techno-Authoritarianism." The new technocrats claim to embrace Enlightenment values, but in fact they're leading an anti-democratic, illiberal movement. The world that Silicon Valley elites have brought into being is a world of reckless social engineering without consequence for its architects. They promise community but sow division, claim to champion truth but spread lies, wrap themselves in concepts such as empowerment and liberty, but surveil us relentlessly.
Fabulous passage from a fabulous essay in The Atlantic. It's sad that one of the best passages in the book is written by someone else, but there you go. No, it's a really great, wonderful passage.
You're not alone in crying out like Cassandra and saying, that there are a lot of people out there who are raising these alarm bells.
Yeah, actually, on Twitter, people pretend that I'm the only critic of this. There's an old rhetorical move, which is to try to diminish your opposition by kind of making it sound like it's one person. So for various reasons, partly because I'm vocal and hard to intimidate and so forth, on Twitter, I often get in these battles, and people kind of portray it as if I'm the only person who's worried about this stuff, which is, of course, totally not true. And other people, for example, Adrian, have been far more articulate about certain aspects of it than I have. So, I mean, in fact, there are lots of people that are worried. There's lots of excellent research on the limitations. Abiba Berhana, for example, has done brilliant work. So, you know, it's a fun fiction to say, oh, Gary Marcus is the Antichrist and he's just a hater and whatever, but it's silly. Another rhetorical move is to pretend that I hate AI, whereas really I hate generative AI and I want to make a better AI. I want to say, I'm not saying boycott AI forever. I'm saying boycott this stuff that sucks so we can have something that works. But, you know, people like to spin their rhetorical.
Well, an ad hominem attack is the
ad
easiest way.
hominem attacks,
Yeah.
There's actually a piece
Yeah.
in IEEE Spectrum. There's an interview with me last week, and it's basically like, why do I put up with all of the ad hominem attacks? Like, why am I doing this?
Why are you doing this?
Because I think so much is at stake. You know, I have 2 little kids. I want them to live in a AI positive world, and we're clearly at an inflection point. Like, I'm not going to do this for another 5 years. I'm losing my voice now. But this is the moment where we're going to make these decisions.
One person asks, we as educated adults are doing the research to try and understand AI. What are your thoughts on how we handle teens and AI?
I wish I had a fuller answer. I mean, I think, let's start with some things I can say for sure. There's no point in having prohibition saying, don't use this stuff. What I think schools should do is to teach kids to think critically about AI and to understand its strengths and its limits. How can they use it? How not? A little while ago, I was telling people that they should, college professors should let the students use ChatGPT, figure out how many hallucinations there are, how they could write a better essay because they're always bland, make it a teachable moment. There's somebody on Twitter says, I used the Marcus method. This was the best free press I ever got. He says, I used the Marcus method. It explains all this. 63 out of 63 students found hallucinations in the papers. So this went completely viral because it was so amazing. Every student found hallucination, but the students then learned something. They learn how to use this technology and, you know, feel viscerally the problems. I think teenagers need to do that.
They need to be taught, and perhaps they also need to teach the grown-ups.
And they probably need to teach the grown-ups. People have to view this stuff with skepticism. There might be a future AI that doesn't have that problem. Like, if we really had the Star Trek computer, I don't think we would have to teach people about its hallucinations. It wouldn't make them. That wouldn't be a valuable skill. But as long as we're in this interregnum where we have really kind of half-baked AI that's widely distributed, people need to understand its limits.
This person asks, as a college student, generative AI is something I see almost everybody use. How do you recommend college students use generative AI in a safer way?
I mean, I think the last question addresses that some. I guess the second piece of it is if you become dependent on it, you're not actually going to understand how you got the answers. You're not really going to learn anything. So, I mean, I would use it sparingly if I were a college student. Like, if your point is to actually get educated and you use it, I'm not sure how much education you're going to get.
I've been, as I mentioned earlier, I've been experimenting. Sometimes I'll run a dual search for some specific information. I try to pick really specific prompts, and I'll try it in ChatGPT, and then I'll try it with maybe Google search, and it's just interesting to see what comes back. What's highlighted, what's not.
Yeah, we used to talk more, by the way, about web literacy and getting students to understand how to interpret a web search and, like, what is the quality of the source and so forth. What is the word for it? It makes opaque the sourcing. And so it's actually harder to judge what is the quality of the answer here because it spits it all out as if it were an encyclopedia, but it's actually a flawed one. It's problematic. There are tools like Perplexity that try to give you some sources, but it's harder, I think, to do the critical work of evaluating the answer as opposed to on a traditional search engine.
I think, just in terms of reading news headlines, for instance, right? You have to know a fair bit about different media organizations to know whether the article you're looking at is coming from a credible source.
You know
And
who
there's so
fails
much
at that?
Yeah.
If I can take a shot at a well-known local, is Elon Musk. The other day, he put out something saying that there had been a third attack on Trump with explosives and so forth. And his source was something called a Muse or something like that. Like, this was obviously not a credible source. And it was such a big thing. Like, if there had actually been, a third attack and explosive, probably a bunch of media outlets would be reporting on it. Nobody else was reporting on it. This is like a complete failure, probably because he doesn't really care, but it was a complete failure to do source evaluation. Like, take such a non-credible outlet, amplify it to, hundreds of millions of people without spending 5 minutes to see whether this, pretty strong claim was true.
And at this point, so many generations, not just the young ones, but those of us who are middle-aged as well, have been trained to, cast a jaundiced eye on what's called traditional media or mainstream media. Like, they must be wrong. However,
Which,
this
by the way,
paid
was
for
not
advertising.
reporting this false thing.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's so this person, let's see, has you're almost surely answered this question before, or you've almost surely answered this question before, but now, how do you respond to a question frequently posed by Tyler Cohen? Do you think over the next 10, 20, 100 years, AI is more likely to make life longer, healthier, happier, or less long, healthy, and happy? And how much more likely?
In the long term, I think that AI will surely make life longer. Whether it makes it happier is actually very unclear because of the dynamics that we're talking about. So, for example, I would consider living in a totalitarian state to be very unhappy. So the happiness is not assured. I'm sure AI will help medicine. Whether we get tangible gains in the short term, I doubt it. So we can think of the war on cancer. People are often naive, right? Nixon introduced the war on cancer. We've made some progress, especially in the last decade, but we still haven't won the war on cancer. People sort of thought it was like a 10-year problem or something. So that was, many decades ago. Most of the remaining medical problems are really hard because we have so many proteins in our body interacting in so many ways. You still need to do long-term clinical experiments to evaluate things. So we're not going to double lifespan in the next 30 years. It's very, very hard to do that. In the long term, AI will play a role, probably in, I don't know about doubling lifespan, but certainly adding 20% or something like that. But these are very hard problems. They're going to take a long time.
But I also think with medicine, right, there's such a smaller margin for error that we find socially acceptable, right? If a chatbot for some company you're a customer of gets your order wrong or doesn't understand what you're asking it to fix, you're irritated, but really no harm, no foul. If an error is made in the practice of medicine, someone could be really hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that in some domains the bar is relatively low and that improvements are certainly possible. So medical error is a huge, huge problem already with humans as doctors. So it's certainly possible to do better. I don't think we're as close as a lot of people would like to think, but it will happen. Same with driverless cars. Like, they're not very good right now, I would say. I know you can use them in San Francisco, but you can't use them in most places, in the vast majority of places in the world. They're still very much a demo. And in most places in the world, they would not be safer than people. They might be here because they have an enormous amount of data. You don't have such terrible weather, et cetera. But a time will come when they are better than human drivers. Human drivers are so bad in some ways. There's room to do better.
Self-regulation might not work, but in the absence of expertise in government, where do we look for potential policies to adopt? Doesn't sound like it's OpenAI. Who is developing AI that we may learn and standardize good practices? Another suggestion, for instance, Anthropic.
I mean, I don't think we should be looking to the companies for the regulation. I mean, the big companies are always going to want regulatory capture. I think it's probably true that Anthropic is a better guide than OpenAI, but you can read my book. I have 11 different policy proposals, and I don't have the vested interest. I'm actually giving away, by the way, the profits for the book. So I have no financial vested interest, unlike these big companies. I think you can look at the AI Act. I think you can look at some of the research that people are doing in the field. I wouldn't go to the companies. I mean, would you go to the cigarette companies to say, how should we regulate our product?
Isn't there also risk from stagnating AI innovation that it could leave us unprepared for the next unanticipated disaster to confront humanity, a disaster that AI could help solve or avoid?
I mean, first of all, I think that the notion that anybody's going to stagnate on AI is wrong, right? The amount of money being invested right now is so massive. Nobody's going to be deterred because they have to do $1 million of paperwork if they're doing $1 billion trading run. It's just not. It's not actually a thing. It's a rumor that Silicon Valley started to fight the regulation, but there is no world in which people are going to slow down right now. You even have companies where, like Anthropic, where the leader of the company says, this stuff might kill you all in 3 years, but I'm racing as fast as possible. So if the thought that he might actually cause the downfall of civilization in 3 years is not enough to slow him down, then $1 million in paperwork for his company that's raised at a $40 billion valuation is not. It's not going to change anything. So I think it's silly to think anybody's going to slow down. I think the real problem is that people are investing in the wrong AI. So if you think about it, take a step back, what we've seen since GPT-4 came out is 7 different companies or something like that, all building essentially the same kinds of models at the same scale, using the same training data, and having the same kind of problems. There's the old saying, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is what the field is doing now. Is $50, $100 billion investment in one idea. That's not the way to make progress. So if there's stagnation, it's because there's a hyper focus on a single hypothesis.
As you say that, though, I think of so many different generations of Silicon Valley technologies where everybody pivots at the same time to do the exact same thing. Whether it's sort of like visors, headsets that are delivering information that, will not land you a date, I guarantee it. Everyone just does it at the same time or decides to drop it at the same time. What is that about?
Venture capital is supposed to foster innovation. But the reality is you get 2% of the money you invest. And so it's in your interest to have a plausible sales pitch. And you can be gone by the time it fails. If you take 2%, on a $250 million investment, you've made $5 million right there. You don't really care if it works, you're gone. And so I don't think venture capitalists are doing a good job of fostering innovation right now. And you might think, oh, Gary Marcus doesn't like AI. I'd actually like to see venture capitalists foster more innovation.
The potential risk of AI in military use feels like it would make the government pay attention and do something. How is that not enough? Never mind the social, political consequences.
I mean, the government's very interested in this stuff. I guess I don't fully understand the question. And the government talks to these companies all the time. If nothing else, they're certainly paying attention.
If generative AI is not good enough for corporate use, is there a different, better solution that could win versus GPT? Wouldn't a trustworthy AI win and solve the problem?
I think absolutely, but I think it's a lot of work to build it. There is a chapter in the book about what it might take, but you have a problem that generative AI is sucking all the talent and oxygen and money from the room, and so it's hard for people to really develop competing approaches. And if you, let's say, have $10 million to invest and employees are expecting $5 million right now, that's 2 employees. You can't do anything with 2 employees.
I guess I wonder, as you're talking, what you think the likely timeline is. It sounds like you're talking about a certain market collapse, if not response finally from government. When do you, just for those of us who are checking our stocks right now, When do you anticipate would be a good time to sell?
The problem is it's about psychology, right? So, I mean, like, look at NFTs. And if you had asked me, whatever, 4 years ago, I forget when the timing is on NFTs because I don't follow it as closely, but at some point I was looking at them and like, this is insane. But how much longer is the insanity going to go? I always think of Wile E. Coyote at the edge of the cliff. Like, he's over the cliff, but he has to look down. So that's what's going on here, is the economics just don't make sense, especially since Meta is giving away the software for free. Like, nobody has a moat. Nobody can say, I can build a product that nobody else can. Like right now, OpenAI has O1. Other people will make something similar. DeepMind had a similar paper the same week. Like, none of this stuff is, in an enduring way, protected intellectual property. And so the economics just don't make sense. But, you know, for a little while, it still makes sense to invest because other people are buying it. So, like, my guess is NVIDIA will not stay at its current level. But right now, other people are buying it. So, like, you know, at what point do you stop buying knowing that other people are doing that? So it depends on psychology. I wrote an article a year ago called What If Generative AI Turned Out to Be a Dud? Not that many people paid attention, although the Financial Times picked up the piece. Now somebody's writing a piece like that every week. If enough people write pieces like that, then it becomes sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then it does collapse. So that could happen anytime. I wouldn't be surprised to see it happen this year, but it is irrationality, and irrationality can persist. So,
in recent years, a popular argument among the members of the C-suite is something akin to "Apprends-moi China." You've got to let us do whatever we're going to do as fast as we can humanly do it. Otherwise, China will take the lead.
if you really believe that, then you should be locking up the people who run Meta, right? Because Meta just handed it on a silver platter to China. So, like, whatever value that argument may or may not have had, at least this generation of AI, and there may be future ones. Let's come back to the notion of a dress rehearsal in a second. This one is there for the taking. China does take it. One of the strangest things I ever saw was Meta's Jan LeCun, who likes to brag, let it be said. Bragging, he said, they recognize me on the streets in Paris and one other city. And what is that city? And the other city is Shanghai. Of course he's recognized on the streets of Shanghai because he's given this software away to everybody in China. And so, you know, they love him there. I'm not sure that's what we in the United States would like to have happened, but that is what happened. So let me talk about the dress rehearsal notion. I don't think, as you can tell, that ChatGPT is all that great. I think there will be better AI. I think we have learned some lessons, or could learn some lessons. One of those lessons is we really should think about intellectual property and open source, and what are the consequences of different technologies being available. Maybe ChatGPT will lead to real destruction. Maybe it won't, but some future technology will. Do we really want to hand this out? We have to think carefully about that. Another thing that we've learned is we're very slow to regulate. And maybe we get away with that this time because the downsides are serious, but maybe they're not catastrophic. Maybe they're just really bad, But maybe the next technology will have catastrophic consequences. If we can't get a bill through California Senate that says you're responsible if you cause $500 million in damage, what happens next time? So I think we should be learning some lessons, even if this is not the final technology, for the next technology.
Wherever you come down on different military conflicts currently pending across the world, we see quite a few countries, Russia, Iran, Israel, playing with AI or generative AI, I should say, as they pick targets, execute on strategies. How long do you think before those strategies come home to roost?
Well, one of them already is coming home to roost, and that's misinformation. So in 2016, Russia spent $1 million a month trying to influence our elections. That's a statistic in the Mueller report. Now they can do the same work for like a few $100s a month. And so can other countries that couldn't get in the game at all, right? And so that is happening, right? There's been some reports already from the federal government and OpenAI and so forth. Russia is using these tools for disinformation in the current election. So some of it is already coming home to roost.
I guess that leaves time for just about one more question, which is you did write this book in a flash and making sure it was published in paperback form so that as many people as possible could get their hands on it. Is there something that in the time it took to publish your manuscript that has evolved and you wish, gosh darn it, I had the foresight, or I wish I could dial back the clock to insert this one last thing in here?
There are and there aren't. I mean, like, I wish I had that covert racism study in there and the false memories. There's certainly some things people can read. By the way, I have a Substack, garymarcus.substack.com, and I try to update people pretty regularly. I'll tell you a story, though, which is when I wrote the book, my worst fear and greatest hope was that the book would be a waste by the time it came out. So, submitted at the end of January. And then I had some months thinking, if Schumer would just step up to the plate, put something out, people could vote for it, nobody would need the book. The book would look stupid, right? Here I am saying the Congress isn't doing its job. Congress has done its job. What a waste. No need to read that book. And so, personally, I wanted people to read the book because I put work into it. But also, like, as a human being, I figured, it would be great if nobody needed the book. Excuse me. But alas, here we are, and we still need the book.
Our thanks to Gary Marcus, author of Taming Silicon Valley, How We Can Ensure That AI Works for Us, the Jackson Square Partners Foundation, and the Ken and Jacqueline Broad Family Fund for supporting tonight's event. If you would like to help continue the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Rachel Myrow. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.